Welcome to this week's Today's Health and Wellness podcast. This is Ashley.
And I'm Brett. The Today's Health and Wellness podcast is a joint effort of the Central Ohio Health and Wellness magazine and Today's Health.
In each week's podcast, we spotlight health and wellness stories you'll find in the magazine, on Today's Health web pages, on our social media, as well as extras you'll hear in the weekly podcasts.
Thanks for subscribing and hitting the play button. Let's get started right after this. Hey, Ashley, we talk about the Central Ohio Health and Wellness magazine every week in our podcast, specifically all the locations around Central Ohio that the magazine is available for pickup. But there's another way to read the magazine, right?
That's right. Our magazine is available 24/7 on our website, ohiohealthandwellness.com. On the website, you can read the latest issue, as well as go back in time to previous issues.
And what I like as well is your search button on the homepage.
That was an important part of building the website for our readers. You can type in any health topic in the search button, and all of the articles we have written and printed come up within seconds for you to read. The link to the website is in the podcast show notes. And connect with us on Facebook while you're online as well.
With the holidays over and work in full swing, many of us might experience some dips in mood, motivation, and lack of energy. Getting back on track takes weeks, and those weeks can be mentally and physically challenging. Luckily, it doesn't have to be that way. If you're one of those people who tends to succumb to the post-holiday blues, we've rounded up the best tips so you can get through the rest of winter happily. With us is Christy Darren. She is a licensed independent social worker. I'm going to let her tell us about her background. Thanks for joining us on the podcast.
Thanks, Brett. I have spent my entire career in education in social work, particularly working with people with mental health and addiction problems. Through the lifespan, I started out working with children and families and graduated into working with adults, where the bulk of my career has been. I'm affiliated with The Ohio State University, where I teach in the College of Social Work. It's one of my passions, teaching others and educating where I can. And then I also work full-time as the Director of Clinical Services at Columbus Springs East, which is an inpatient psychiatric hospital here in Columbus, Ohio. And we also have outpatient services as well.
Great. Well, let's talk about post-holiday seasonal blues. What are some causes that we should recognize?
Well, the post-holiday seasonal blues are typically created among a lot of different aspects. So one could be just staying too busy. Mm-hmm. You know, we spend a great deal of our time focused on other people and tasks and making those perfect purchases and focusing on so many things at one time. It can become overwhelming, and it would be normal to shut down at some point, or it just becomes too much. The other part of it can be if you're at the other end of the spectrum where you're alone at the holidays, or you have a smaller core family or friends, where it can sort of highlight, if you will, the loneliness that may already be existing. And then sometimes it's just highlighted by loss of family members earlier in the year, or this is the first holiday you're going without a pet or someone that was close to you. And I think sometimes it's just December's placed at the end of a year / beginning of the next. Mm-hmm. And we're all evaluating where we've been and where we're going. And so you throw that in there with some of those mood feelings and differences and that sort of thing. And let's not forget being around family, maybe 1 or 2 times a year that you're not typically around. And that does take some adjustment as well.
Right. We talked before the podcast to bring this up as well. And I think it's really important that not to let this season mask some bigger problems possibly. Yes, seasonal blues does happen, even the seasonal affective disorder because of lack of light, as we talked about at the end of the year. It's becoming darker sooner, and especially in the Midwest, Ohio specifically, we have a lot of gray days without the sun. But this time of year could also bring out some difficulties that maybe, again, we don't want it to be masked during the season, but at the same time, understanding and also seeing in others and yourself what could be some problems that are actually deeper.
That's for sure. And this time of year, you use the word mask very appropriately, that because we're so busy or we're taking time off work to try to settle our minds and that sort of thing, you can really become occupied by other things when really there was an undercurrent all along that actually might be sort of highlighted a little bit more so. And if I just stay busy, or I go to that party, or I, send everyone I know a card, that sort of thing, you can kind of be forgetting about yourself a little bit and overlooking what a problem already is.
With those deeper issues, what are some signs to take a look at? I mean, they're much different than just the seasonal holiday blues. And we want to get back to that as well, too, because I want this episode to go both directions, so we can see the differences in something that's a bit more important than, and again, not to make light of seasonal blues, it's important, but the other issues are more long-term.
Sure. So one thing that a lot of folks are familiar with in terms of terminology is major depressive disorder or depression. And what's different between depression and the seasonal blues is the longevity and the pervasiveness that those situations have in a person's daily life. It's not just about having a couple of weeks that are sad or maybe not wanting to be around people, because again, it can be pretty overwhelming in the holiday season, and it would be normal to want to just isolate a little bit or not go to that party you were invited to, sort of thing. But depression can give a lot of different signs. And clinically, there are 9 different criteria for meeting a depressive disorder. You really only need to meet 5 of those 9 to actually have clinical depression. Some of the things that we see quite a bit and folks will just kind of write off are the common things like a change in eating habits, particularly a decrease in appetite. But for some people, they'll eat more than they typically would, which again, in the holidays is kind of hard to see because I know myself, I do the same thing. And then also a change in your sleeping, particularly too much sleep or not enough sleep. So insomnia, where maybe you fall asleep, but you don't stay asleep. And then we have hypersomnia, where you're sleeping quite a bit. Then we have loss of pleasure. So of a variety of categories. The things that you normally would have taken pleasure in are no longer of interest to you at all. It's more than just, no, not today. It'll be pervasive and every day. You literally don't want to be around those loved ones that you normally like to be around. Maybe spending time with friends or, your normal card game, those sort of things. You are not interested in that at all. Other signs would be kind of an increase in fatigue. And so much related to the change in sleep habits, the fatigue is an overwhelming feeling of, I can't get out of bed, I'm just really tired, or having to take naps when you're normally not a nap person. That can be a sign as well. Also, things are decrease in concentration. That's often something others will notice in you, where you're maybe a little more scattered than usual and you're not able to focus on a task for a period of time, or there's forgetfulness. And again, it's pervasive. It's not just a couple of bad days. So kind of the list goes on, but those are the ones that people see the easiest. And then, of course, the big shebang is the mood change. And what's important to note about depression itself is it can look different to different people. Most often it looks like sadness, easily to tear, things that normally wouldn't have made you sad, kind of become pervasive and you think about a little bit more so. But they can also look easy to agitate or easy to anger. Now, I don't mean explosive, because that can be something different, but easy to agitate and just annoyed extremely easy. That is a very common symptom for adolescents. So for adolescents, their depression most often looks like a mood swing, which of course teenagers always look like, right?
Exactly.
So, and then in older adults, namely grandparents or aging parents, depression, while also important to note, we don't change the criteria for meeting the depressive disorder, but it looks differently. You may see them standing off a little bit or not as talkative, maybe just coming in later to an event and leaving early, not spending as much time as they normally would. And it'll look a little more isolative. But of course, if you ask, how are you feeling? Or you look a little sad. Older adults are slow to recognize, much less want to share with their loved ones out of the avoidance of worrying you or being a burden or something of that nature.
Right. How much time should you give when you see, let's say, a family member you think something's going on, but you know the holidays have just ended? And again, that masking situation. How long into the new year do you give it?
I would say the first thing that comes to mind is how serious is this? Okay. So, for example, if a person has voiced or they know themselves are thinking about suicide, or they've made an attempt or a gesture, as it were, meaning they've gone and purchased items to include in the plan, or maybe they're starting to harm themselves by burning or cutting or something of that nature, that certainly is more of immediate. So it's not so much time as it is circumstance.
Right.
And beyond that, if it's feelings and thoughts, making sure that you're talking to people that you trust or people that you feel really comfortable with, and being able to be mindful of how much is this really kind of invading my day, because we're talking about every day a person feels like this. So you wouldn't go a couple of days feeling crummy and then for a couple of days you're elated and you're suddenly wanting to be around people. That could actually be a different type of problem. And I also throw in the use of substances. So oftentimes around the holidays, we'll have some folks will, drink alcohol more frequently, and maybe in some cases using some other substances they wouldn't normally use. So taking into consideration, those things can actually make the feelings worse. You don't want to pause on reacting to that either. So don't second guess. Go see your doctor, or you can see a licensed independent social worker through counseling who can diagnose as well, and at least start the conversation, because it's really never too soon. And any professional that would say, well, this might be this or might be that, make sure you make a follow-up appointment. So even if you came in what you thought might have been too soon, come back in another 30 days or a couple of weeks.
As a spouse or a friend of a loved one or a friend, what are some tactics, let's put it that way, of approaching that person, of saying, hey, how are you doing? You don't get the answer that you're really expecting. They're going to cover it, or they don't recognize it themselves possibly. What are some ways that person who has the concern approach that person?
That's a great question, because that can be kind of a hard and sometimes difficult conversation. So I'd like to think of them as strategies. Okay. One strategy in the conversation is to make it about you, what you're concerned about, what you see, and not make it about the other person, such as if you notice the person's isolating, to approach someone and say, I notice you're really isolating, or you're keeping to yourself. It sort of puts them on a defensive that they have to prove why that's not really happening, versus, Dad, I'm really concerned about you. You usually enjoy being around the family, and I noticed you might have just not wanted to be so much, and I'm worried about that. And making it more about your observations and less about the person's behavior or even things they said. Kind of not going the route of, Dad, I noticed you're drinking a lot. And Dad's going to say, well, yeah, you give me the reasons too, right? Instead saying, Dad, I'm just really concerned. I just noticed you spent a lot of time around Uncle Bob this time, and Uncle Bob drinks a lot, and it's not really like you. So I really want to know if there's something going on. I want to be there for you. And kind of giving the person that resolution as well, that you don't just leave them hanging out there on, well, now what do I do with this? Now my loved one's worried. Offering a solution there.
Really looking at it, bottom line, keep them from being defensive.
Right.
Offer them the opportunity to open up to you,
right,
that you're showing concern, true, honest concern about what's going on, but make it you're concerned about them.
That's right. And then the other really important strategy is normalizing. So being okay with if someone is sad or if their behavior is changing, that there's something normal about that for them. It's normal to feel sad around the holidays for particular reasons. It's also normal to go and talk to someone about it, because depression is treatable. People live with it every day. They don't suffer from it if they can become active in their own treatment and management of it. Suffering is not part of depression there are ways to get better and ways to manage.
As you mentioned, it is treatable. We talked about it a little bit earlier as well. There's still a large stigma with this. How do you get that person you're concerned about to see someone? What are some strategies to do that?
Now we're starting to enter into how willing is the person to go and talk about it, because that's often the biggest barrier, especially when I work with family members and they say, well, can't you just make them, and then fill in the blank, make them take medication or make them go see someone? And my answer is, unfortunately, no, I can't. But what I can do is be unconditionally involved in providing the support, be willing to go with them. If that means taking a morning off work, that's what you have to be prepared to do. Asking them, how can I help you? Because sometimes what they would think of would be much different. Maybe they'll say, no, I can go on my own, but I just don't want you asking me any more questions. You have to be prepared for that and being okay with that. But this is the hardest part, is taking that first step and saying there might be something going on that I don't have control over, or much less that I think I've caused in some way, which of course is not right.
Right. But we also do recognize that, seasonal blues happen. The holiday season is very intense, a short-term intensity of maybe up to 6 weeks. But there are some ways to kind of help yourself transition out of the holidays. What are some strategies we can use to help ourselves, help our friends as well, just say, hey, the holidays are done. Let's get back to normalcy. But it does take a little bit of time.
I think the key first is your expectations, understanding that things take time, and then creating what is normal for you. So for some folks, it's creating a to-do list. For other people, it's throwing the lists in the trash and being tired of being bound to their list like the holidays made for them. But it's also sort of being realistic about what things mean to you. So we were talking about pets before everything started here in the podcast, and the importance of investing in someone or something than yourself. Sometimes that can really help ground you too and bring things back to normalcy. Slowing down. So one of the things I'm always talking to my kids about in particular is unplugging. So we can be really plugged in and we've got our cell phones and, we're on social media and all of those sorts of things, but being able to really slow down and listen and pay attention to ourselves, our bodies, those sort of things, and involving yourself in things that are purposeful. Giving to others is great and to some extent really feeds you, but when you give too much, you start to feel it. Your tank is drained, as I'm always saying. My tank is low, right? I'm in a helping profession. I'm constantly helping other people. And while I'm very driven to do so, I have to pay attention to my own self.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much for all the advice, tips, and strategies to help us and get through it, as well as our friends and family. Appreciate you being part of the podcast.
Sure, no problem. Thanks a lot.
Thanks again for listening to this week's Today's Health and Wellness podcast, brought to you by Central Ohio Health and Wellness Magazine and Today's Health. If you have a health and wellness segment you would like us to cover, send us an email. Our contact information is in the show notes.
And if you'd like more information about sponsoring our podcast, like Ashley just mentioned, our contact information is in the podcast notes. We look forward to hearing from you.
Circle270media.com.
Thanks for saving money with us. If you have money-saving tips you want to share, we would love to hear from you. We'll talk about them in a future podcast. Just head to our Facebook page at facebook.com/DollarSavingDivasCBus.
Leslie, that's kind of long. We do have a link to our page in the podcast notes. When you subscribe to this podcast on iTunes or your favorite podcast player, these podcasts can automatically upload to your smartphone. Now get out there and start saving money. We want to hear from you.